a war that shaped the Mediterranean forever, long before Rome became the empire that would dominate the ancient world, and long before Carthage became a symbol of maritime wealth and power. The Mediterranean was already the most important stage of civilization on Earth. It was not just a sea, it was a lifeline. Every major civilization that touched its shores depended on it for trade, survival, and expansion. Grain from Egypt, metals from Spain, luxury goods from the East, all moved through this vast blue network that connected continents long before modern globalization existed. And within this system, two powers began to rise on opposite sides of the same world, Rome and Carthage. Rome was not born as an empire, it was a republic built through struggle. Every generation of Romans grew up in a system that demanded discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty to the state above all else. Its strength came not from wealth or naval dominance, but from organization and endurance. Carthage was completely different. Founded by Phoenician settlers, Carthage became a commercial superpower. Its influence spread not through land conquest, but through trade routes, ports, and naval dominance. Its wealth came from controlling the movement of goods across the Mediterranean. For a long time, these two powers avoided direct conflict. They operated in different spheres of influence. Rome expanded across Italy. Carthage controlled maritime commerce, but geography does not allow balance to last forever. At the center of their overlapping ambitions lay one crucial island, Sicily. Sicily was not just land, it was a strategic command point over the Western Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Sicily could control naval access between North Africa, Italy, and Spain. It was inevitable that both powers would eventually turn their attention to it. By 264 BCE, that tension finally broke. The First Punic War began, not because of one event, but because two expanding systems reached the point where coexistence was no longer possible. Rome entered this war as a land empire in formation. Its military strength was based on legions, highly disciplined infantry units designed for close combat, endurance, and tactical flexibility. Roman soldiers fought not as individuals, but as part of a structured machine. Carthage entered as a maritime empire at its peak. Its navy was advanced, experienced, and feared across the Mediterranean. Carthaginian ships were fast, its captains highly skilled, and its naval tradition centuries old. At the start of the war, the imbalance was clear. Rome had no real navy, no maritime tradition, no experience in sea warfare. Carthage controlled the sea almost completely. Most historians would have predicted a short war, but history rarely follows prediction. Rome made a decision that changed everything. It chose to build a navy from nothing while already at war, while already under pressure, while already stretched across multiple fronts. This decision alone marked one of the most extraordinary transformations in ancient military history. Roman shipyards began mass construction of warships. Engineers studied captured Carthaginian vessels in detail, and within a short time, Rome created something that shocked the ancient world, a functional navy capable of challenging Carthage at sea. But Rome knew it could not match Carthage in naval experience, so it changed the rules of engagement. The Romans developed a device called the corvus, a heavy boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships. Once attached, it turned naval combat into land combat. This was revolutionary. Instead of ship maneuvering and ramming tactics, Rome forced battles into hand-to-hand infantry warfare, where Roman legions were strongest. When the war reached its first major naval engagement at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Carthage faced something unexpected. Roman ships did not try to outmaneuver, they did not try to outsail. They attacked directly, boarded enemy vessels, and turned the sea into a battlefield of infantry warfare. Carthage was shocked. Rome had entered naval war and refused to play by traditional rules. For the first time, Carthage was forced into adaptation. As the war expanded across Sicily, the conflict became larger, more complex, and far more destructive than either side expected. Cities were captured and recaptured, ports became military targets, and supply lines became more important than battlefield victories. Rome relied on one core principle: persistence. Even after losses, it rebuilt. Even after defeat, it returned stronger. Carthage relied on another principle: superiority at sea. But superiority alone was not enough, because war was no longer about single battles. It had become a system of endurance. Rome absorbed losses and improved. Carthage faced internal pressure and logistical strain, and slowly the war shifted from a quick campaign into a long war of survival. As the First Punic War expanded beyond its early phase, it stopped resembling a simple territorial conflict and transformed into something far more destructive. a prolonged war of systems, endurance, and national capacity. What began as a struggle for control of Sicily was now a full-scale confrontation between two completely different models of power. Rome represented structural endurance. Carthage represented maritime dominance and economic wealth. But war has a way of testing not just strength, but sustainability. And in that test, everything began to change. Sicily became the central battlefield of the ancient Mediterranean. Its cities were no longer thriving trade hubs. They became fortified positions, constantly shifting between Roman and Carthaginian control. One year a city might belong to Rome, the next year to Carthage, and then back again after another campaign. Nothing remained stable. Nothing remained untouched. Entire regions were devastated as armies moved back and forth, destroying infrastructure, burning supply stores, and cutting off agricultural production to weaken enemy control. The war was no longer about capturing territory. It was about denying it to the enemy. At sea, the conflict was even more unpredictable. Rome had entered naval warfare as an inexperienced power, but now it was becoming increasingly capable. Each engagement provided experience. Each defeat revealed weaknesses, each victory refined its system, but the Mediterranean Sea itself remained an uncontrollable force. Storms often did what enemy fleets could not. Entire Roman and Carthaginian fleets were destroyed by sudden weather changes, with ships sinking before ever reaching battle. One of the most devastating Roman losses occurred when a massive fleet was destroyed off the coast of Sicily in a violent storm. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were lost, not in combat but to nature itself. This highlighted a brutal reality of ancient naval warfare. Control of the sea was never absolute. It was temporary, fragile, and always at risk. Despite catastrophic losses, Rome refused to withdraw. This decision became one of its greatest strategic advantages. Where other civilizations might have sought peace after such disasters, Rome treated them as setbacks in production, not failures of purpose. It rebuilt fleets, it retrained crews, it replaced commanders, and it returned to the sea again and again. This relentless cycle of recovery became Rome's true weapon. Carthage, meanwhile, began to feel the strain of prolonged warfare in a very different way. Unlike Rome, Carthage's strength depended heavily on trade networks and maritime commerce. As the war disrupted shipping routes, revenue began to decline. Maintaining large fleets became increasingly expensive. At the same time, Carthage relied heavily on mercenary forces for land campaigns. These soldiers fought for payment, not loyalty. When victory slowed or payment became uncertain, discipline weakened, coordination between commanders became inconsistent, and battlefield effectiveness declined. Rome's military system was fundamentally different. Its soldiers were citizens. Their service was tied to identity, duty, and survival of the state. This created a level of resilience that mercenary armies could not match. Even after heavy losses, Rome could rebuild its legions through internal recruitment and allied contributions. This structural difference became increasingly important as the war continued. Sicily itself became a symbol of exhaustion. What had once been a rich and strategic island was now a fractured battlefield filled with ruined cities, burned farmland, and exhausted populations caught between two empires. Sieges could last months or even years. Entire cities were starved into submission or destroyed after resistance collapsed. And yet neither side could afford to abandon the island, because Sicily was not just territory, it was control over the western Mediterranean. By the middle phase of the war, it became clear that neither Rome nor Carthage could achieve a quick victory. The conflict had entered a new phase, a war of attrition. And in wars of attrition, victory does not belong to the strongest, it belongs to the most sustainable. Rome's political system played a critical role here. The Roman Republic was not dependent on a single ruler or centralized authority. Instead, it was structured in a way that allowed continuous decision-making, resource allocation, and a military recruitment even during crisis. Losses in battle did not collapse governance. Defeats did not stop mobilization. The system continued functioning regardless of setbacks. Carthage, however, faced internal political divisions. Different factions debated strategy, resource allocation, and long-term priorities. Some supported continuing the war at all costs. Others warned about economic exhaustion and declining returns. By the final phase of the First Punic War, both Rome and Carthage had been pushed to their absolute limits. What had begun as a regional conflict over Sicily had evolved into one of the longest, most exhausting, and most resource-draining wars of the ancient world. Nearly 2 decades of continuous warfare had reshaped both civilizations. When economies had been strained, populations had been exhausted, entire generations had known nothing but conflict, and yet neither side had been able to deliver a decisive blow. But now the war was approaching its final conclusion. and everything depended on one thing: control of the sea. Without naval dominance, no army in Sicily could be supplied, reinforced, or sustained, and without Sicily, neither power could dominate the Western Mediterranean. By this stage, Rome had transformed completely. What began as an inexperienced land power with no naval tradition had become a disciplined maritime force. Roman fleets were no longer improvised collections of ships. They were organized, trained, and increasingly capable of executing coordinated naval operations. The early reliance on the corvus had diminished over time. Roman sailors had developed better seamanship, improved maneuvering techniques, and more effective battle coordination. Rome was no longer forcing naval war into infantry combat alone. It was learning how to fight at sea. Carthage, however, still possessed deep maritime expertise. Its sailors were among the most experienced in the ancient Mediterranean world. Its ships were fast, efficient, and well designed for naval engagement. But experience alone was no longer enough, because the war was no longer decided by individual battles. It was decided by sustainability. Rome could replace losses. Carthage was beginning to struggle. As the war dragged on, Carthage faced increasing financial pressure. Its economy depended heavily on maritime trade routes that had been disrupted by continuous warfare. The longer the war continued, the harder it became to fund large fleets and maintain naval dominance. Rome, on the other hand, benefited from its internal network of allied states across Italy. This allowed it to distribute the burden of war more effectively and maintain a steady flow of manpower and resources. This structural advantage became decisive over time. In 241 BCE, the war reached its final turning point: the Battle of the Aegates Islands. This battle was not just another naval engagement. It was the culmination of nearly 20 years of adaptation, learning, and endurance from both civilizations. Rome entered the battle with a well-prepared fleet, trained crews, and a clear strategic objective: cut off Carthage's ability to supply Sicily and force an end to the war. Carthage, meanwhile, attempted one final effort to break the Roman blockade and reinforce its remaining forces on the island. But the conditions had already shifted irreversibly. Roman fleets were now more disciplined and coordinated than ever before. Their ships moved with greater tactical precision, and their commanders understood naval warfare far better than in the early years of the war. Carthaginian ships, while still formidable, were heavily burdened with supplies and less maneuverable in open combat. The result was decisive. Rome won a complete and overwhelming naval victory. The Carthaginian fleet was destroyed or captured in large numbers, and with that, Carthage lost its ability to sustain its military presence in Sicily. The consequences were immediate. Without naval support, Carthaginian forces on the island became isolated. Resupply routes collapsed. Reinforcement stopped completely. One by one, Carthaginian positions fell. The war had effectively been decided at sea. Carthage, unable to continue the struggle, was forced to negotiate peace terms. In 241 BCE, the First Punic War officially ended. Rome emerged victorious. Sicily was transferred into Roman control, becoming its first overseas province. This marked a historic transformation in world history. Rome was no longer just a regional power in Italy. It had become a Mediterranean force. Carthage, though not destroyed, suffered a major strategic and economic setback. Its naval dominance had been broken and its position in the Western Mediterranean significantly weakened, but the true significance of the First Punic War lies beyond territory or victory. It demonstrates one of the most important principles in history. Power is not determined only by strength, it is determined by adaptation over time. Carthage began the war with naval superiority, wealth, and maritime experience. Rome began with land-based power, limited resources, and no naval tradition. But over time, Rome adapted faster. It absorbed losses, it rebuilt continuously, it learned from every defeat, and it transformed itself into a system capable of sustained war at scale. Carthage, despite its strengths, could not match this level of structural adaptability. The breaking point: how Rome turned survival into victory. By the time the First Punic War entered its final years, this was no longer a war about ambition, it had become a war about endurance. Both Rome and Carthage were exhausted. For nearly 2 decades, the Mediterranean had witnessed endless destruction. Sicily had transformed from a thriving strategic island into a battlefield of ash, broken walls, ruined ports, and starving cities. This was no longer a contest of strength. It was now a contest of who could continue suffering longer. And in wars like this, survival itself becomes strategy. Rome understood something that Carthage was beginning to feel too late. The war would not be won in a single battle. It would be won through pressure over time. Every lost ship, every fallen city, every dead soldier, every drained treasury, all of it was slowly pushing both powers toward a final breaking point. But one system was built to absorb pain better than the other, and that difference was about to decide the fate of the ancient world. For Carthage, the war was becoming economically dangerous. Its strength had always come from trade, sea routes, merchant wealth, colonial taxation, maritime dominance. But now the sea itself had become contested. Roman fleets, once inexperienced and almost helpless, had become increasingly disciplined. Trade routes were interrupted, supply convoys were attacked, the naval movement was no longer secure. This was devastating for Carthage. And because unlike Rome, Carthage's military machine depended heavily on economic liquidity. Warships required constant maintenance. Mercenaries required payment. Colonies required defense. And the longer the war lasted, the more these systems began to strain. Meanwhile, Rome's model functioned differently. Its strength came from structure. Roman citizens were deeply tied to the state. Military service was not simply employment, it was duty, it was identity, it was survival of the republic itself. This allowed Rome to continue replacing manpower at a rate that shocked its enemies. Even after major defeats, Rome returned again and again and again. This relentless recovery was psychologically devastating for Carthage. Every Roman defeat that should have ended the war became merely another phase of it, the final transformation of Rome. Something remarkable had happened during this war. Rome had changed. At the beginning of the conflict, Rome was a land power forced into unfamiliar territory. Its commanders lacked maritime experience. Its sailors were inexperienced. Its fleets were crude imitations of Carthaginian models. But years of war had transformed that reality. Now Rome was no longer learning how to survive at sea. It was learning how to dominate it. Roman naval commanders had developed tactical discipline. Crews had become better trained. Ship movement, formation control, and timing had improved dramatically. The early dependence on the corvus boarding system had started to decrease. At first, the corvus had been essential because it turned naval combat into infantry fighting, but now Roman seamanship itself had improved. This was critical because it meant Rome was no longer compensating for weakness, it was developing genuine naval strength. And that terrified Carthage, because the very domain that once guaranteed its superiority was no longer secure. Sicily, the war's unforgiving heart. At the center of everything remained Sicily. Even after years of bloodshed, neither side could abandon it. Its ports connected North Africa to Italy. Its cities acted as supply anchors. Its coastline determined naval reach. Control of Sicily meant control of the Western Mediterranean. Both empires understood this perfectly. Roman commanders tightened pressure across the island. Instead of focusing only on spectacular victories, they increasingly relied on siege warfare and blockade systems. This was classic Roman strategy. Control movement, starve resistance, cut resupply, force collapse. Carthaginian strongholds that once appeared secure now faced increasing isolation. Supplies dwindled, morale weakened, mercenary discipline became unstable. The longer this continued, the more Roman pressure turned into suffocation. This was no longer open warfare, this was strategic compression, and Carthage was being squeezed. The final naval gamble. By 241 BCE, Carthage knew the war was reaching a point of no return. If Sicily was lost, Rome would emerge as a Mediterranean power. That could not be allowed. So Carthage prepared one final naval effort, a last attempt, a decisive mission. A fleet was assembled to resupply its remaining forces and break Roman control around Sicily. This was not just another military expedition. This was the last serious chance to change history. Rome understood this as well. Its fleet moved to intercept. The First Punic War teaches one of history's greatest truths. Victory does not always belong to the strongest beginning. It often belongs to the side that evolves fastest. Rome did not start this war as a naval power. It became one. Carthage did not lose because it lacked strength. It lost because its system could not endure prolonged adaptation pressure the way Rome's could. This is what made Rome different. Failure never ended its campaigns, it improved them. Defeat never destroyed its will, it hardened it. And that ability to transform under pressure would become the defining characteristic of Roman expansion for centuries to come. This was not merely a war over Sicily, it was the birth of Roman imperial destiny.